screen starts glowing and the film starts rolling. You wanna be knowing what you might be in for. So give the show a listen and find out what you're missing. Put yourself in position for the easy good score.
Hi, everybody, and welcome to The Goods, a film podcast. It's springtime. It's Easter week as we're sitting down here, and there's more of us than usual gathered around the table. So, sound off, everybody. Who's out there?
Well, Brian, I'm here as usual. Always fun to talk movies, and especially fun when we have some guests. And that's right, plural, guests. So around our virtual table, we have someone who's been here before and someone who hasn't been here before. So the first person is Gavin. Welcome back, Gavin.
Hello, nice to be here again.
And as a special treat, we also have Gavin's father, Kevin.
Long-time listener.
Well, we're grateful for that. Thank you for joining us, Gavin and Kevin. Now, Kevin, I don't know if you know this, but you're a little bit of a celebrity on one of the film discussion forums that Gavin and I are both in. The alternate ending. It's a different podcast, but it's a forum that Gavin and I are both in, and he sometimes shares your movie takes on there.
Yeah. Well, I'm here to defend myself.
Okay.
We've had something of a dad theme on the podcast lately, so it's good to have... well, I guess all three of you, Dan, Gavin, and Kevin, are authentic fathers, but really bringing the paternal energy.
I guess I should explain is that, basically, Dad, whenever you send me a movie opinion, I edit out personal information and share it with people in movie discussion. And I don't think I've told you every time I've done that, like your opinions of Snow White have been shared, for example. But the major specialty is films about law. And I think the first real breakthrough is when you wrote me a multi-paragraph WhatsApp message about Anatomy of a Fall. And then a couple of days later, you had more thoughts about it and wrote a several-page document outlining all of the legal peculiarities of that. And then I asked you to do it again with the Canadian drama Red Rooms, which I also did. So, I mean, I don't know if you knew I showed Anatomy of a Fall, but I did, and I specifically asked you to do Red Rooms.
You actually warned me that you were going to do that. So on Anatomy of Fall and on Red Room, the legal proceedings were closer to reality than Anatomy of a Fall. So, which is kind of weird because in this case, your topic for today, what occurred in the actual trial, some of that is bizarre by legal means as well. That stuff just doesn't happen in real life, but it did. So, which makes the film all the more interesting.
It's not a coincidence that I picked a film about law. I picked a film about law and a film about religion because those are our two respective areas of specialty. And that was the thinking behind it. And it just happens to be the centennial of the Scopes trial.
That's right. So longtime listeners will remember that Gavin is a biblical scholar of sorts, religious scholar, more on, ancient texts of Judaism.
Right. It depends on what audience I'm speaking to. I could be a biblical scholar. I could be a scholar of ancient Judaism. I was whatever's hiring. If I feel competent to teach about it. Yes. Bible was my inroad to all those things. And Bible's what we'll be talking about today. So I guess, yeah, I'm a biblical scholar.
Perfect. And so we've had you on to talk about various films that have had religious themes. Been some very fun and enlightening episodes. You raised the intellectual rigor of our podcast when you join us, Gavin. But Kevin, maybe tell us a little bit about your background.
Well, former teacher, high school, and but my main profession has been as a lawyer and as a professor of law, mostly school law. So that's why I have such an interest in the John T. Scopes trial.
So when you say school law, does that actually mean like law regarding education?
Yeah, laws that affect education, which are both civil and criminal.
Okay.
It runs the gamut, the kind of things you would expect, curriculum fights, which happen all the time and will continue to fight. And then other things like that deal with abuse and neglect. I mean, it runs the gamut. So school law is actually a very, very broad topic that covers both criminal and civil.
It's very interesting and extremely relevant to today's film. Like, you couldn't line up something that better fits this film. So Brian, why don't you tell us what this film is that we're going to be talking about today?
Yes. So, listeners, as Dan was just saying, Gavin has joined us several times before, and the films are always thought-provoking, often hard to track down. We've had to jump through some hoops. We've digitized VHS tapes. The last one I had to translate from scratch. Not so this time. This was actually very easily accessible. It's called Inherit the Wind from 1960, a film inspired by a play that was inspired by the Scopes monkey trial from 1925. Over the issue of a law in Tennessee that said you couldn't teach the theory of evolution in school.
So, Kevin, if I understood the way that Gavin pitched us on this film, is that this is a film that is one that you treasure. This is a favorite of yours, perhaps?
It is. The first time I saw it was actually in U.S. history class in high school, a couple of years after it came out in the theaters. We had a right-wing U.S. history teacher, who hated Roosevelt and wanted us to hate the New Deal. And of course, the New Deal was many years before us. But he felt that this picture unfairly portrayed the people of Dayton, Tennessee, even though it takes place in mythical Hillsboro, in a state that we don't know where the state is, other than we do know from the film itself that it takes place in the South.
Right. So a couple key things that both you and Brian hit on there is that it's there's a word for this kind of movie or this kind of story where they've very, very loosely fictionalized it. Like Citizen Kane is another one for one of those publishers. I forget which one it is.
Yeah, it's kind of ripped from the headlines a bit.
Right.
When it's a novel, I think it's called a roman à clef, where everyone stands for a specific real life person. But I'm not sure if this would count because it's also heavily fictionalized as well. I mean, it's clear who each of the principals are if they do have a real life. Not all of them have real life counterparts. I don't know if there's another technical term.
I think that's the one I was thinking of. Yeah.
Okay.
But
It's a cautionary tale.
So the legal events took place in 1925 originally. The play was written in 1955. And I was kind of thinking of The Crucible in the sense that it's a courtroom drama that is a real historical story, but it was told in the 50s for a reason, in a time of political and social events that were like tense, but also in a sense absurd, with the whole McCarthy, HUAC thing going on, Cold War. So I don't think it's coincidence that this story was told on stage and in theaters at this time that it was.
Yeah, there's no question about it. The intent was both in Arthur Miller's The Crucible, which was staged a few years before Jerome Lawrence and Robert E. Lee came up with Inherit the Wind. But both of them are directed at the types of things that today we refer to that era as McCarthyism, but it was more than just Till Gunner, Joe McCarthy. There were lots of other people. You mentioned the House Committee on Un-American Activities. Basically, people were being trashed, their lives and livelihoods destroyed based upon opinions and associations, which are supposed to be constitutionally protected, and not for something they actually have done. And that's one of the lessons you've got here. Bertram Gates is our character here. Now, he did do something, But we'll get into that later when we talk about the unholy alliance between politics and religion.
So this film, based off of a play, and that play has been adapted several times, but this is easily the most famous of them. The cast it's got some great turns here in the cast. 1960 film directed by Stanley Kramer. Kramer, I've seen a handful of Kramer films, generally regarded as someone who was kind of the last wave of directors before New Hollywood became a big thing. And so I think there was a phase where he was kind of out of fashion, kind of stodgy, like a late relic of the studio era. And I think his films often had a reputation for being preachy. That said, I found it, anytime I watch older films, I find it refreshing. The film's like actually directed and there's blocking and you can tell that everybody knows what they're doing, which you can't always say with modern films. But maybe that's just selection by survival. What's it called? Survival bias, survivorship bias. That the ones that were made by people who knew what they were doing are the ones that stuck around. But I don't know. But I think if ever you would call this film sort of old-fashioned, or at least Kramer old-fashioned, this story in particular, I don't think it would be controversial to say that the themes are timely, that some of this has endured. And I think we can maybe dig into it. We tend not to talk too much politics on The Goods for a number of reasons. One is that I kind of view movies as my escape from the headlines. But then again, art is political, so inevitably there's politics there. Also, I don't know, we've got divergent views of people who tune into The Goods and record The Goods, I think. Would you say that's fair, Brian?
I think that's fair. One thing that I really value on the podcast is the tit for tat setup. It's each week we trade films. So it's very egalitarian, and I want to keep it that way. I want to preserve the status quo in as much as possible, and so I try not to rock the boat too much. We keep things civil.
But you can't really talk about this film and why it matters without noting that it's a recurrent theme in U.S. history. So I kind of started a thought there about the talent involved. So let me just finish that thought, which is that the cast, Spencer Tracy plays Henry Drummond, and Brian's, who made some of these episode notes, has made a crib sheet. So I haven't actually read all that much about the trial. I learned about it in history courses throughout my education, but it's been several years, and I actually did minimal reading. I kind of wanted to come in fresh, be reminded of what the historical facts were as we kind of talk through it here. But I understand Clarence Darrow. Is that how you would pronounce that?
Mm-hmm.
And then we have Frederick March playing a character named Matthew Harrison Brady. And this one I did know. He is based off of William Jennings Bryan, who is someone who shows up all over history books if you're ever reading about U.S. history.
He usually shows up twice, right? once for the Cross of Gold and once for this.
Mm-hmm. His statue, though, was on the Rhea County Courthouse. They didn't put Darrell there, but William Jennings Bryan's statue is actually in the Rhea County in Dayton, Tennessee. His statue is there.
I think they added a Darrow statue. That was in the book that I read in preparation for this. Is that some I don't know, some kind of ACLU type group or some other demonically affiliated institution wanted to have a Clarence Darrow statue, so they have him pointing at William Jennings Bryan. It's like that bull with a little girl in front of it.
Interesting.
Well, tit for tat.
Darrow was an ACLU attorney, and the ACLU was actually representing Scopes. Anyhow, nevertheless, egalitarian. The pigeons treat them both the same.
I thought March looked a lot like William Jennings Bryan. I saw a photograph, and it's actually pretty similar.
Mm-hmm. In fact, he's the only one that does.
Right.
He down to the bow ties. William Jennings Bryan loved the bow ties. And he even had that in a couple of scenes. Of course, the courtroom was so damn hot, it became, and it really was, it became impractical to do that. But, we can get to some of the other weird things that were in the courthouse.
I was actually curious, everybody. As we said, just the tenor that this is presented with, it's combative in some ways, and so maybe the claws will come out today more than normal. I was just wondering, could we get like a quick rundown on what are y'all's religious backgrounds, current, like if you're currently attending a church, and since we're talking legal as well, legal backgrounds, just a little bit more about your legal backgrounds. We heard Kevin's, but have any of you taken law classes of any kind?
So I guess I'll go first. I've mentioned it several times on the pod that I grew up Roman Catholic. My parents went to Notre Dame, raised pretty devoutly Catholic, practiced Catholicism pretty devoutly through my 20s, I would say. And then my 30s have been a time of spiritual searching. I no longer consider myself a practicing Catholic, but I am in a state where I'm trying to figure out what my spiritual life looks like as I exit young adulthood and enter adulthood, let's say, and I'm raising a family and all that. My daughters are baptized Catholic, but we don't go to Mass very often. We go a few times a year, usually like with other family. And it's kind of a topic of complexity and tension for me. Because much of my family still does practice. Also, politically, I tend to be progressive, and that's kind of tied with the complexity of my religious beliefs and my spiritual life. So let's just say this film kind of spoke to me as addressing some of the things that I've been personally struggling with over the past several years. So I found it very enriching and fascinating, but that's just me. And obviously, Gavin and Kevin, to the extent that you're willing to share about these things.
I don't mind sharing, even to the extent that you have. I mean, I was raised Catholic as well. I'm still practicing. So we're in the middle of Holy Week, so we're about to enter the Triduum, which is like the most important part of the liturgical year. I think most importantly, I was raised, I want to say typically post-conciliar household, but I'm not sure people know what that means. Which means I grew up after Vatican II with the liturgical reforms and guitars in churches and Marty Haugen and David Haas music. So it's just kind of a church that was already semi-reformed, but also, thanks to the malign influence of my father, lots of interest in science and history, and specifically dinosaurs and paleontology and evolution. So like that's something that I never really thought about. It actually came up in the book I was reading about. Catholics really didn't care about the Scopes trial. And so in that sense, I was raised in a typically Catholic family. I never thought about evolution as being in conflict in any way, even though I came across books at my Catholic school. One about dinosaurs is said at the beginning. It does not concur with Genesis 1. And also I was prevented from checking out a book on Greek mythology once because it was heathen. I don't know why the library even had it in the first place. But that's right. So, but also as I became more interested in the study of the Bible, I learned a lot about fundamentalism, and also it comes along with anti-Catholicism. So like part of my religious identity is not being a fundamentalist. I guess I should say I have a pretty strong anti-fundamentalist bias, although I will try to keep I want to talk about the history of the movement at some point, and it will be historical objective. These are basically opposed to the very things I do in my work. Some of the tracks that inspired people like Brian criticized something called higher criticism, which is like precisely what I do in my day-to-day life. But I think I'll wait to talk about that a little bit later.
Well, like Gavin said, we are a Roman Catholic household, and we're very active in the church. I sing as a cantor And I also play woodwind instruments for liturgical services. So this is a really busy week, as Gavin said. We had Palm Sunday, then we have Holy Thursday, which in Protestant sects they refer to as Maundy Thursday. Then we have Good Friday, Easter Vigil, Easter Sunday. So yeah, it's a really busy week.
One damn thing after another. Today's actually called Spy Wednesday. That's what it's really called. I don't know if that's like an Anglican thing. I think Catholics even call it too. It's and it's just there's no special mass for today. Usually I watch a spy movie on today, but I didn't have the chance.
But to a point, you're right, Gavin, that a movie like Inherit the Wind doesn't speak a lot to Catholics, but that's not to some Catholics, because we have fundamentalist Catholics. We have, I don't want to call them kooks, but they certainly, anybody that's going for a literal interpretation of the Bible is not exactly in concert with Catholic theology. Even St. Augustine said some of these things were to be able to illustrate significant points about creation and God to people relatively simple backgrounds. I mean, we've had two popes speak to evolution. Pope Pius XII and Pope John Paul II both indicated that evolution is not inconsistent with the creation of the world. It goes back to really one thing that I'm surprised that fundamentalists don't understand or don't embrace is the statement that God's ways are not men's ways. And that was a point in the movie that Spencer Tracy was trying to get across, is that not only is this not a Christian concept of fundamental belief in the literalism of the Bible, but it's just some Christians, that there are a lot of Christians who don't believe it was a day. And why does it need to be? Why does God need, to provide a magic show just for our benefit? A day to God could have been 10 million years. Who knows? God knows, but why does it have to be solar days? And that was in the movie, but it was also in the trial itself. So, I mean, this is an important time for us because it is, leading up to Easter. And with Dan, there doesn't mean that everything has been smooth. There are some things that occur, because God created us. We do believe that. But there's a lot of things that men do to screw this up. And there's some things that happen in the church hierarchy that cause us to scratch our heads and maybe not always agree. Trying to get down to what the fundamental purpose is the one thing you always strive to do. And Gavin's right. We talked about everything, when he was growing up, including, I think I introduced him to the first time to some of the dissenters in the church and the Gnostics and a few others. So just to get him thinking.
we will not be talking about Gnostics in this podcast. It's way too complicated. It's not relevant.
But we might be talking about agnostics, which is
we are. Oh, good. I like that.
How I might qualify myself. I was raised Protestant primarily. My dad is a little bit more devout Protestant. My mom was from a Catholic family. But I primarily attended a Methodist church. It's been a while. And I'm trying to kind of grapple with where exactly I would fall. Maybe there's an element of deism. In my experience, things don't tend to come from nothing. And we have something here. Things exist. The universe is here and we're part of it. And I can't claim to know how it came about. So there was probably a beginning at some point. But I don't know that I've spoken to God, with God. So I don't have a lot of answers. I try to ask questions. I've found it's good philosophy to trust the man who seeks the truth and doubt the man who claims he's found it.
And I think that is not a terrible summary of some of the themes in this film. I mean, I think to some extent, everybody's going to look at Inherit the Wind and see inconsistencies and flaws in the ways that various characters act and think about things. I think it pretty clearly comes down on one side. I don't think that's very controversial. But why don't we actually talk about it here now that we've all kind of level set how we are approaching this from our life positions and our backgrounds. So The Scopes trial, and by the way, the name of the Scopes character is Bertram Cates, played by Dick York. And maybe, Gavin, can you give us like a 30-second overview of like historically, what was the Scopes trial? What was the case actually about, and why was it actually important?
To be honest, I think my dad would answer that question better. I could give the background on fundamentalism as a movement, but the actual what led up to the case was a development of anti-evolution laws by Brian and other crusaders. Dad, would you want to take this one?
I can.
Background.
Sure.
Okay.
In February of 1925, Tennessee became the first state to actually pass a law that forbade the teaching of evolution in the publicly funded schools, especially because they viewed it as denying the literal creation of the world that appears in Genesis. If you read it literally, immediately the ACLU was looking for a test case, and they actually advertised for a teacher in Tennessee willing to be basically the figurehead for a test case. The other side wanted the test case as well. But this really, the movie Inherit the Wind makes it look like, this was a religious type of movement. But actually, the entire idea for the trial and its location was commercial. It really was. Both sides knew that this would, especially on defending the statute itself, which, unlike the film, the statute is actually defended by the Attorney General for the state of Tennessee. And they had William Jennings Bryan come in. The ACLU brought in Clarence Darrow, who was a member of the ACLU, and they put this whole thing together. John T. Scopes never really faced any possibility of paying a fine or going to jail. In fact, he never did go to jail, which is one of the big differences between what actually occurred and the film itself. There are some other ones, bigger stuff in the film that never existed or never happened at all. Anyhow, this was really a test case. And when you say it that way, it doesn't sound nearly as sexy as the film itself. But that's really what it was. And the ACLU was concerned that other states, especially down south, would start passing similar laws. And that's why they wanted to nip it in the bud if they could. And that's why the whole thing was set up. Scopes was in on it. He volunteered to be the defendant in this. He was, he supposedly, and I say supposedly because it was never actually proven that he ever taught the segment on evolution in his class. But everyone just assumed that he was going to do it. They set it up, and then you have the trial. But the trial became really a drama of a war between William Jennings Bryan and Clarence Darrow, two people who had previously been friends. So it's, as we say, it's short. It's short on legal effect, but it's big on drama, and that's what makes it so interesting. Dayton, Tennessee, and Rea County, where it's located, this was a huge commercial success for them. July are hot summer days in rural counties anywhere. Those are dead times. But boy, did they make a lot of money on this because it drew a heck of a lot of interest, including the first nationally broadcast trial, and that was WGN. In the movie, you only see them at the end, but they were actually there at the beginning. Rea County had to put in additional lines for all the different media that wanted to be present, but it was WGN that actually broadcast this, made it the first nationally broadcast trial.
Funny that you would describe this movie as sexy. That's not the first word that I would use, but I understand what you mean.
Actually, to be honest, I think when I rented the film, it did say something. There was like a warning, sexual content. And I think it refers to literally the question they ask on the stand. What do you think about sex? Yeah. That's enough to get it like a PG rating nowadays or something like that.
That felt pretty erotically charged to me. William Jennings Bryan's response is like, in what context is the question asked?
Well, you have all this begatting going on. That was the point too. Everyone's begatting, and and then they make a big deal out of it. If you beget, which I assume is a form of begat. Oh, now you're tapped with original sin. So that's why he's asking, what do you think of sex? Is sex sinful? But if it is, and everybody in this county is, boy, they're real sinners.
Well, I can talk a little bit about the textbook that Scopes may or may not have used, because I consulted it, I downloaded it. It's called A Civic Biology by a fellow named Hunter. I'd have to check the first name, and it is first of all, it's 440 pages of small print. So I don't know how, this is the beginning of mandatory public education in the U.S. I don't know what high schooler would read a 440-page textbook. It is quite dull. There's about 6 pages on evolution toward the back, and it is racist as hell. It is there's one point where there's 2 different sections. One in evolution, which is pretty bog standard, how you explain evolution to a high schooler. It talks about Darwin, about natural selection. And then there's another section talking about eugenics. And he starts his section by, first of all, listing the races in order from worst to best. And then he talks about what the solution about how poverty and mental illness can spread genetically, and the solution, which has already been tried successfully in Europe, it's actual live in the textbook, is to stop them from breeding further, which kind of ties into one of William Jennings Bryan's bugbears about evolution, is that he associated the teaching of Darwinism with social Darwinism, which is the idea that natural selection still applies to modern humans, that we should be rapacious and aggressive because that's how society evolves. It's kind of idea, and he specifically associated it with the cause of World War I. He was a non-interventionist. He did not want Wilson to get us into the war, and he said that as long as I'm Secretary of State under Wilson, which he was, we will not enter this war. And so when they did enter the war, he stepped down, which is kind of amazing to have that kind of level of integrity in a politician. He was a Democrat. He identified as a progressive, and I wrote down somewhere all the things that he advocated for, which is very, this is a combination you don't really see often. Populism is one of them. He had the name The Great Commoner. Women's suffrage, generally viewed as a good thing. Prohibition, generally viewed as a bad thing, especially for us Irish Catholics. Labor, pro-labor, so the cross of gold speech. The direct election of senators, there's a controversial idea. He hated the KKK, so presumably, I don't know about his views on race, but he at least hated those guys. So he seems like a typical liberal, except that he was a foaming at the mouth fundamentalist. I don't want to take up all the time here. I don't know at what point we should actually discuss fundamentalism as a religious movement, or if anyone wants to chime in and say anything else about the historical context.
Yeah. So I'm a little curious about that, and we've kind of laid the base of who some of these figures are, and I expect we won't need to go beat for beat of the recap because we're getting some of these elements of the story. So I am curious, what is fundamentalism as it applied in this era, at least?
Right. So, a lot of people use the term fundamentalism rather loosely to refer to any kind of religious extremism, fanaticism, but it actually refers to a very specific movement that took place in America at the beginning of the 20th century, and it takes its name from a number of tracts, religious tracts that were distributed between 1905 and 1915, called the Fundamentals. And these were written, there's about 60 booklets written by a wide variety of Protestant ministers from different denominations, so Presbyterians, Methodists, Baptists, on a wide variety of topics. But the general tendency is anti-modernism. And by modernism, they mean specifically materialistic evolution. And I have to qualify it because some of the writers did believe in a theistic idea of evolution. Some of them advocated for evolution within these tracts. And they're also enemies of what I mentioned as higher criticism, which was a developing idea that basically the books of the Bible were not written by the people to whom they are attributed, taking aim especially at the idea that the Torah was written by 4 anonymous authors instead of Moses in one go. But since that doesn't directly apply here, I won't get into that too much. These books were later edited into 4 volumes, which were distributed as cheaply as possible, again, to several Protestant churches. And about the same time, a book came out called a Bible with notes by Cyrus Scofield called the Scofield Reference Bible. And he introduced the American public to the idea of premillennial dispensationalism. And if you don't know what that means, it means left behind stuff, rapture. It's very peculiar ideas about God. So it's like God's view for the church in Israel are quite different. It's basically a very positive evaluation of Israel and modern Jews, which tied in, of course, to the ongoing, at the time, Zionist movement. Brian was not a dispensationalist, at least, so I don't have to talk about that. But I do have to talk about what are these fundamentals. So it's kind of it's literally a reactionary movement, reacting to modernism into new ideas in science and biblical criticism. And they outline what are the things that are really essential to the Christian faith. And there are 5 fundamentals. And I wrote them down, and they are, the first one is the inerrancy of the Bible, which is the one that's on trial here. They only talk about Genesis in this movie. They never talk about Jesus or any of that. So the second fundamental, like all the rest, are about Jesus to some extent. The virgin birth of Christ, the substitutionary atonement of Jesus' death. And it's important that it's one specific theory of atonement, whereas like the Catholic Church, for example, does not advocate for a specific theory of atonement. The bodily resurrection of Jesus and the validity of biblical miracles, which I guess could also tie into Genesis 1. And that seems rather innocuous.
I was going to say, those don't seem wildly askew from some of the values that I was taught.
Your values may be, so to speak, askew.
I think it's the way they're implied. It's like the fundamentals, like when you put them all together, it's 4 volumes of 1,500 pages. So it's not just, the 5 points.
Right.
It's also the idea that, Daniel must have written the book of Daniel. Anyone claiming differently is a heretic, or all the miracles must have happened as stated. This idea of biblical literalism, like even when you say something is literal, this is how Clarence Darrow got Brian on the stand, is he forced him to interpret something in a non-literal manner. It's like we're jumping to the end of the movie. We have to get through the rest of it. But anyway, that's the essence of fundamentalism. So it's like it became a cross-denominational thing, and eventually kind of its own. It's weird because it's not a specific denomination, but kind of a spectrum in which all the denominations can meet up. The rather conservative end of the denominations, and it preceded evangelicals, or the evangelical movement, which was more of a post-war thing. And hence we don't need to talk about it.
Well, you don't, but you also sort of do. Maybe not directly, because
maybe at the end, as we don't have, this is Billy Sunday rather than Billy Graham. It's like the fundamentalists became slightly more insular after the trial, and evangelicals were trying to make common cause with other Christians instead of damning them all to hell. Brian was. Even in this movement, he was eccentric. Like, he does not fit the mold. He does not fit a Billy Sunday mold, and that's what I find fascinating about him. As in all other respects, he's a fairly liberal politician with this one hang-up.
Every time you call William Jennings Bryan, I'm like jerking my head.
I apologize.
But that is...
It's like, what did I do? What am I doing?
But William Jennings Bryan, when you kind of talk through all of that, that is kind of an interesting profile of a politician and a public advocate that's very different from, I don't know, the type of figure I feel like you would see today. I can't think of anybody who quite fits that mold, at least like in the mainstream national politics these days. But it is kind of interesting.
And by the way, William Jennings Bryan got the presidential nomination 3 times. Never elected, obviously. No President Bryan on the books.
One cast member that we didn't point out yet that I just want to point out is we have Gene Kelly in here as a reporter from Baltimore. The character's name is E.K. Hornbeck. I wouldn't have guessed he was based off a historical figure, but you wrote down a name, Brian. So H.L. Mencken?
That's right.
Yes, that's correct. And I only learned that reading about the trial, but it's definitely the mark.
I didn't realize he was based off of someone myself until I read about the trial. And H.L. Mencken sent back these sarcastic reports. Like, first of all, he works for a Baltimore newspaper, and the names are vaguely similar. So it's like there's no doubt in my mind, knowing after the fact, that he was supposed to be the smart ass journalist.
He was the journalist of his day, and he was not just a journalist, he was also an author, but he was there to cover it as a columnist. So he was sending back all of these, and they were not flattering of William Jennings Bryan or any of the people in Dayton or any of the people who supported the prosecution or the law. And the one thing you do know, the character Gene Kelly is playing from the Baltimore Herald, who in the movie, they're the ones who bring in Clarence Darrow. But that's not, Clarence Darrow came in with the ACLU because he belonged to them. And it shows them actually rooming together, which never happened. And it shows him sitting at the defense table, making snide remarks. He shows the hangman, the poor old Scope and making snide remarks to to Brian, the other Brian, not you, Brian, making all these snide remarks and things like that. That never happened. You don't have media people sitting at the defense counsel's table. The whole thing was, but the one thing you that it is H.L. Mencken's stand-in is that you wouldn't know this unless you know a lot about H.L. Mencken, and he really was a Renaissance man. There's a lot of things bad about him, but for the most part, he was an elitist, a pig in a lot of ways. But Gene Kelly, his character, he is actually quoting H.L. Mencken's some of the content from his columns that he wrote. You see this in the hotel room. Actually, you see it when he first meets. Clarence Darrow, well, in this case, Spencer Tracy getting off the bus, and he says, "Welcome to the buckle of the Bible Belt." Well, the whole concept of calling the South the Bible Belt was H.L. Mencken. He's the one who came up with that term. He's also the one who came up with the term for monkey trial. He's the one that created that. So he was very clever. He's an excellent wordsmith. And a lot of the stuff you hear, including the discussions you have between the H.L. Mencken character and the Clarence Darrow character, didn't actually occur, not to each other. But Clarence Darrow said those things, and so did H.L. Mencken, or wrote them. Like when they were talking about the obituary, Gene Kelly's complaining he's going to have to write about William Jennings Bryan. He's complaining about that, and then Clarence Darrow character, says some plauditory things, good things about William Jennings Bryan. Well, he did say those, and they were in the obituary. So, that's where this stuff is coming from. There are a lot of things in here that the writers, the playwrights, Lawrence and Lee, took from published accounts elsewhere and put them together into dialogue for the play that eventually showed up in the movie itself. A lot of that occurred, more than people realized.
I really enjoyed the Gene Kelly character and the performance, and I think it's because of that wit that you described, Kevin, is that he's kind of always coming in as like a bucket of cold water on this extreme rhetoric with his sort of cynical wit. And it's, of course, Gene Kelly's just a charming deliverer of these little lines.
Yeah, Gavin kept saying, "When's he going to dance?" He's in a drama. He's not dancing about.
I was wondering if this was like really. I haven't seen too many Gene Kelly movies apart from Singing in the Rain and Xanadu. I don't know if this was against type for him to be so cynical. It's like, I don't know. Like, is he cynical in American in Paris? Have you guys done a lot of Gene Kelly stuff in your?
Not on the podcast. I've watched American in Paris, but man, now I want Singing in the Wind. We need the musical version of this.
But he's not really an idea. Singing in the Rain, he's a little cynical too. I don't know. I was just wondering, why would you hire Gene Kelly and not make him dance unless it was deliberately against type? I'm not convinced it's entirely against type.
Yeah, I did find it interesting how the Mencken character, it's like his job to be snarky, and he just kind of assumes that Spencer Tracy is on the same side that he is, and in some ways they are, but Spencer Tracy has more interiority, more sentimentality, and then the final exchange of the movie is Spencer Tracy basically saying, things mean things to me, man. I'm not all about the headline barb.
Mhm. They're very different people, and they really were, and they were not buddies, they weren't enemies, but they certainly weren't buddies. But like I say, there was just one other incident when they're in the hotel room again and the people are outside burning him in effigy. And, there's an elitist statement that is made by the Gene Kelly character that, it's a shame that our system of government set up that, people like that, are able to control government, and basically ruin it for people like us who are smart, intelligent, all those kinds of things. It's a very quick statement, a very elitist statement, but it's one that H.L. Mencken stated over and over again in his writings. He was not in favor of the representative government we had because it let the unqualified have too much leeway over the qualified, in his estimation. He was an elitist.
I should point out that they didn't actually burn anyone in effigy in Dayton, Tennessee. I think that the portrayal, so I don't know if we're going to go straight like in chronological order the movies. I think we've already gotten into the muck here. It was like the portrayal of is it called Hillsborough here? It was like at
Hillsborough.
at some point the real stuff like overwrites the fictionalized version. They portray them as it's character assassination almost. Like they're hillbillies, like they're uneducated, and they're just like they go around singing the same hymn over and over again. And like I believe that Dayton was actually more liberal in the surrounding area of Tennessee. Is like they were Methodists in a sea of Presbyterians, or Presbyterians in a sea of Baptists, or something like that. And they were more curious about the trial than having decided that Scopes should burn for his crimes. I don't think they had anything against Scopes at all. As I say, the first line, the movie is the first scene where they arrest him. Is Scopes volunteered to be arrested, basically. It was kind of a setup. So you have this really kind of Manichaean positioning of the townspeople that really is kind of unfair to them. They're welcoming of Darrow and the defendants.
Well, Lawrence and Lee, especially Lawrence, tried to explain over and over again that this is not a retelling of the Scopes monkey trial, that it's being used, parts of it, for another purpose, and it's not accurate. I mean, he said that over and over again, but people didn't ignore it because you like the drama. But as I said before, there was a commercial aspect to all of this. This was set up to make a lot of money for Rhea County and Dayton, Tennessee during the dog days of July. Nothing's happening down there. So this was a big commercial thing. But yeah, all that stuff. And you're right. I was thinking about Stanley Kramer. I bet he doesn't have a movie that ever had a soundtrack that anybody wanted to buy. In this case, you've got one song that they sing over and over and over again, followed by the Battle Hymn of the Republic a couple of times. So you got basically two songs, and they're aggravating no matter how you portray them. Although I do know you wanted to talk about the beginning of the movie, and that's just kind of interesting. The beginning of the movie, the Hillsborough courthouse, you have Leslie Uggams, who is singing, "Give Me That Old Time Religion." And she's singing it a cappella with that drum beating in the background, and that's actually pretty dramatic. I thought that was good, but when you hear a jazz version of the same song later on, and those people are singing that song when they're all parading around and getting all hot and bothered, to lynch something Christian, I don't know, but it goes on, and they're singing Battle Hymn of the Republic when they want to burn people in effigy, but you've only got two songs. Back in 1960, I don't think they understood, the profits you can make from a good soundtrack, even if you got a lousy movie.
A couple thoughts here. One is that you mentioned the dog days of summer. I thought this movie did a terrific job of like really making you feel hot. You know that it's hot. They really emphasize it. I don't know if when they filmed it, it was actually this hot, but like the sweat and the fanning and the throngs of people, I was like, oh, I've been in heat like this. And I just know how like enveloping it is and just completely distracts you and like wears down your faculties. So you can almost understand why, the character playing Darrow, the Henry Drummond, would be at the edge of his rope during that one scene where he kind of has a breakdown in the middle of the courtroom.
Right. I really wanted to praise the production values, especially with regard to the fact that it's hot in the story, and that really, really comes across. It's almost like Spike Lee Do the Right Thing. That it's this small little area, this like one town square, and then even more so this one courtroom that everything is confined to. And they say it's like 97 degrees and will probably get hotter. And you can tell that like every time they cut, they're like running out and spritzing the actors with a spray bottle because it's just running down them. And, their shirts are dripping and they got puddles everywhere. And then like there are these old timey ceiling fans, but also they all hand out these like promotional hand fans from the funeral parlor.
Tyler, I love that detail. That made me laugh so much.
Now, in the real trial itself, there were over 900 people in the courtroom. You consider that it's July 10th to July 21st, in the South, and it's going to be hot. It's going to be humid. It was so bad that some of the proceedings actually were taken outside and conducted under their shade tree.
Wow.
So, in real life, that's actually what did happen. So, yeah, it was hotter than blazes. We'll be nice about it. Hotter than blazes in that courthouse. And when you consider that was a small courthouse in the film, there were 900 people in there for every day of the trial.
Wow.
Yeah. I can't imagine. But yes, you really got the sense, and you're right. You really got the sense it was hot.
Another thing I was going to call out from a couple things you said there, Kevin, a minute ago, is that you used the word lynching. We talked about the effigies and the marches in the streets. And I don't think it's a coincidence. This came out in 1960, entering an inflection point on the civil rights movement. I have to guess it was intentional that it was evoking images of racial violence, at least not like trying to necessarily equate the two of them, but it's particularly that scene where they're marching around with the effigy, and I don't know if it actually had a noose around its neck, but it very well could have. And I feel like that would have made it particularly evocative for people of the time to kind of understand how this sort of fervor could take over the Southern community. I don't know.
There were still lynchings occurring in 1960. They still happened. So, yes,
Right.
I can imagine you could not see that film without thinking about that. It's almost impossible to do so, all while they're singing some sort of Christian-based gospel type of song. Hallelujah.
And the way that this story kind of unfolds is I really kind of saw two major aspects to it. So one is we have this trial, and Kevin, at some point I'd like to hear your thoughts on like this actually unfolding as a trial or lack thereof of like proper trial procedure, I guess. But then the second piece is definitely secondary because this is really more about the rhetoric, but kind of getting a little bit of a character study on these two lawyers, the Drummond character who's Darrow, and then the Brady character who's William Jennings Bryan, and the ways that they're in some ways similar and in some ways very different, and how they're each kind of living contradictions of sorts throughout. And I thought it was not the most procedural film, I guess, maybe unsatisfying if that's what you're looking for, like a real dissection of the laws and the ways that this, fulfilled the law and kind of commented on the law, but really just more about the ideas. And these characters and these men and the way that they kind of personify the ideas or don't personify the ideas under discussion here.
Yeah. one thing to keep in mind is William Jennings Bryan was not known as a courtroom lawyer. He was known as an orator. And one thing you always do is you play to your strengths. And so, yes, there's a tendency to be somewhat bombastic. And he is portrayed in the film, as being really past his prime. And that, it's almost as a parody of himself. And in a lot of ways, this was not his best day. Darrell, on the other hand, was known as lawyer for the damned, because he had represented with the ACLU a lot of very unpopular defendants. I mean, very unpopular defendants during the 20th century. So I mean, he was a tried and true criminal lawyer. So he's a little bit better at this than William Jennings Bryan is going to be. But then again, unlike it shows in the film, these guys were not acting alone. I mean, there were 5 defense attorneys for Scopes, and there were the same number. No, excuse me, there were 6 attorneys representing the state. So, William Jennings Bryan can pontificate all he wants to. But when it comes down to actually questioning witnesses and stuff like that, he wasn't the one doing that. But he could pontificate. Now, that's one of the questions I know you're going to ask. It shows them speaking eloquently to the jury when they're supposed to be, cross-examining or examining a witness. No, that didn't happen. No judge is going to let that happen. In this case, be honest with you, Harry Morgan, who's playing the judge, does a masterful job. He is very judicial. I mean, he really is credible as a judge. But the original judge who had this, consider this poor guy. Here's his schlep. He's a county judge. He's an elected official. And here are 2 behemoths of Americana in his courtroom. He's having some trouble controlling them. So, yes, there was some trouble controlling them, especially when it came to the critical issue of whether William Jennings Bryan could be called to testify. That's the one thing that makes lawyers drop their jaws. That first, that Darrell would actually attempt that, and 2, that Darrell was banking on William Jennings Bryan being such a blowhard that he would take the challenge, which he did, which was stupid, incredibly. First off, you cannot call opposing counsel as a witness. You can't do that. And in this case, he's calling him as an expert on the King James Version of the Bible. It has to be the King James Version of the Bible because earlier in the actual proceedings, over Darrell's objections that there are more than one Bible, the judge in the actual case admitted the King James Version of the Bible into evidence. So it's into evidence. And that's the only thing that he really can. In the movie, it shows him using a Gideon's Bible from the hotel. But it was actually a King James version, fully blown version of that's being used here. But no, you can't call opposing counsel. But Bryan, he takes the bait. Not you, Bryan. William Jennings Bryan takes the bait, and he agrees to testify. The judge is saying, he's trying to save him. And the judge should have said, no, that can't happen. And if you actually are a witness, you can't be representing a party. So even if Bryan, when he accepted and said, yes, I'll be a witness, although he was never really qualified as an expert, he should have recused himself at that point because you can't be a witness and represent a party too. So yes, it just blows attorneys' minds that this ever happened. And sometimes if you never know nothing about it and you see inherit the win, you go, that could never happen, but it did. That's the biggest thing. The other thing too is when you have objections, you're not allowed to go on pontificating, and to the jury and speaking to the jury and flourishes and stuff like that. The judge will call you up there for a discussion at the bench. And if it's going to be protracted and it's going to be hot and heavy, the judge will send the jury out of the room so they can do all they want to, argue, stuff like that. You don't do it in front of a jury. And this is a jury trial. So yes, a lot of that stuff you saw, again, what they said, they did say that, but they didn't say it in the courtroom. They're taking, they're taking speeches and elements and things from other things that Darrell wrote or said, or William Jennings Bryan said. For example, let's go back to, the examination about the Bible. And, William Jennings Bryan makes that snarky remark that, I only care about the Rock of Ages, not the Age of Rocks. Do you remember that when he's showing him the stone that's 10 million old? William Jennings Bryan actually did say that, but it was in a rally after the trial. Shortly before he died, he made that statement when he was trying to rehabilitate his image among the fundamentalists. So, I mean, stuff like that. There's a lot of stuff in here that that Lawrence and Lee put together to create the dialogue. It's very clever what they've done, but it didn't all happen in the courtroom.
Two things about what you said. I asked earlier if Dan or Gavin, if you had taken any law classes. I took a semester of introduction to law in high school. It was called street law. And so what I know about law is about as much as I know about Star Trek, which is that I sat down and learned about it for, a few days, few weeks. And then sometimes I find myself in rooms with people who have less legal education than that. But I wrote down in my notes watching this movie, he's letting these lawyers make speeches too much. It's like, that's not how it works. It's they are able to ask questions of the witnesses, and if they wander too far afield from that, they're going to get reined in. And then, just as you said, Kevin, Darrow calls Brian to the stand, and my thought was, impossible. This wouldn't happen. But then I was also simultaneously, I had my two-screen experience with my phone up next to the TV, and it's like, oh, this happened. It's like, oh my gosh.
It is crazy, but again, this shows you Brian's deterioration. William Jennings Bryan, he would take the bait on something like this. This guy's no expert, on how can you be an expert on the King James Version of the Bible? But it was just an attempt to undercut him. Now, the fight they had over the expert witnesses that Spencer Tracy brought in, that did happen. And, it's very abbreviated here, but he tried to bring in a zoologist, an archaeologist, paleontologist. He tried to bring in these people from Tennessee universities for the most part, because you want to use local people as much as possible. And the judge did refuse over the objections. He sustained the objections of William Jennings Bryan and the prosecution to keep them out, because this is all about the Butler Act. And there's no science involved in the Butler Act. So it's just a question of, did he teach, as Gavin pointed out, the book he actually used was not The Descent of Man, which is in the movie. He actually was using a state-approved textbook. Racist as all get out, but a state-approved textbook when he taught that lesson that began the test case. So he actually wasn't teaching from a Darwin book. Also, one of the other things, John T. Scope was not from Tennessee. He was from Illinois by way of Kentucky, which is kind of funny because William Jennings Bryan is from Illinois by way of Nebraska, and that comes out a lot. Well, this is a trial tactic. Do you notice how often they would talk about the learned gentleman from Chicago in referring to Darrell?
Yeah, they treat Chicago like it's
It's a Sodom and Gomorrah to these people. That the whole part is to prejudice the jury by doing that this is a big city slicker coming down here, our little podunk place, and telling us what the law is, what Tennessee law is, when he's not even from here. That's a tactic that's used. That does happen a lot. And that's why sometimes law firms will hire local counsel, because you don't want to go in there and get homered. That's what they refer to it as, getting homered, because you're from some big city. So that's why they did that a lot.
A couple things on that had me thinking of, they talk about the North and the South in this a lot, like that Northern lawyer, and there's some phrases, some snatches of dialogue that I swear you replace like Northern city guy with coastal elite, and you could hear coming out of a politician today. Like, it really, the rhetoric in some ways felt very modern to me. I'm projecting a little bit, I think, but I found that pretty interesting. But you mentioned, I found this scene very interesting, and it's one of the few moments of the film where it's very frustrating as a viewer, because if the premise of the trial, and I know this is not really what the trial was, but of course this is how it's dramatized and how it's spun, is, religion versus science. And there's, everyone in this community is very religious, at least the way it's portrayed here. And the defense is trying to say, okay, well, we're going to bring in these educators who teach science and talk about what the science actually is and how we can actually teach the science. And then it gets shut down over and over and over again. And it is kind of portrayed as this sort of like cultural block of being unwilling to kind of engage with science and reality. But I think what you kind of point out is that from like a legal perspective, that really was not the thing that was on trial. So there maybe was reason to not let them kind of be witnesses, expert witnesses.
See, it was a gimme from the beginning that he violated the Butler Act. They've sort of made a passing argument that he didn't violate the act because he didn't disparage the Genesis version, and he taught from the state accredited textbook. So, how can he be violating the law? But the second tack was to attack the law itself. If that argument doesn't win, and it's not going to, then it's the constitutionality of the statute itself. And that's really what the ACLU is after, because if they could establish that this was unconstitutional, it will stop other states from passing similar laws. And in fact, it was actually mildly successful in that way, because in 1927, when the Tennessee Supreme Court reversed Scopes' conviction on a technicality, the judge assessed the fine rather than the jury, as Tennessee law required. In 1928, Arkansas passed a law just like the Butler Act, and Mississippi followed soon after. And it was the Arkansas law that was passed in 1928 that was eventually found unconstitutional by the Supreme Court 40 years later. So it took a while for this to get there. But
I got the sense that the overturning the conviction on the technicality is a way of preventing it from getting to the Supreme Court.
The one thing they didn't do here, and this is, this was a big signal, is that the Tennessee Supreme Court's 3-1 vote, they overturned on a technicality, but they also found that the act was constitutional. But they didn't order a retrial, and the prosecution never petitioned to retry. So basically what everybody's saying here is that this will just be a curiosity. It'll sit on the books, but no one's going to enforce it. And that's pretty much what happened. There was no attempt ever to enforce this law again. And so that's and you're right. In a lot of ways, you're right. They don't want that going up to the U.S. Supreme Court. You don't want it going up there because you have no control over what's going to happen with these people up north, what they're going to do. So, it's interesting how they did that, but they weren't going to undermine the legislature. And the signal was, let's let this go by. Everybody got what they want. You got your show trial. You made a lot of money, which was at the heart of a lot of this. So, let's let it go. Yeah, you.
So that's a real religion in America, is capitalism, unfettered capitalism, and smoking chimps.
That's an interesting thing about the chip. That's the one thing you notice is not in this film. There's no statement that the SPCA was involved to ensure that the animals were treated fairly.
Dude, that chip is actually smoking a cigar.
Does it matter?
Or is it a cigarette?
Does it matter?
I don't know. I'm just curious. Like, we talked a lot about things that actually happened. I want to talk about the things that are fabrications, pure fabrications. It's pretty easy to tell what stuff is completely made up. It was like, first of all, the trial date, like, it was almost 2 weeks in real life. The Scopes trial was 12 days?
Yeah, it was July 10th to the 21st.
Here they frame the days in the courtroom sort of like action set pieces in action movies. You have 3 discrete ones. The first one, the jury selection, and then we talked about the third one where they put the climax, basically, where they put Brady/Brian on the stand, and then the middle one involves Kate's fiance, who is coincidentally also the daughter of the raging hellfire preacher. Both of these, like, pulled out of thin air, did not exist. I don't know why Scopes didn't have a girlfriend in real life. Maybe he was about to become a PhD student, so that might explain it.
Yeah, that was the one that stuck out to me, was that he's engaged to the preacher's daughter. That's a little too dramatically convenient. So I assumed that was manufactured.
One of my friends was like, I don't know, what do you think? Who's the actress's name? I should look her up. The character, I think, is named Rachel.
Yes, Rachel.
and played by Florence Eldridge. And no, that's incorrect. That's Mrs. Brady. Donna Anderson.
Donna Anderson.
Donna Anderson. Excuse me. Right.
Donna
So
Anderson.
what do we what do we think of her performance? Like, because I feel like the character is written is quite flat, but maybe the performance elevates it a little.
I could tell that she seemed like she was from maybe not a different movie, but like a more dramatic cinematic situation than I don't know. It felt a little incompatible with the rest of the film. I don't know. That was just my thought. It wasn't really any problem with the performance, but I concur with what everyone else here said, that like this is very obviously a little bit of movie magic, you might call it, or fabrication.
We got to have a Jack and Rose.
That's right.
Sports melodrama, right? It's just, and her father is the worst kind of fundamentalist preacher who believed that a little boy who drowned went straight to hell because he wasn't baptized. So I guess you could make an argument he was baptized at the end. That comes out of nowhere, and it's like Scopes or Cates rather as this golly gee all-American hero. I mean, I do like the fact that at the end of the second day, he's taken in by the farmer who was the father of the boy. That was kind of a nice touch, but I don't know. Like, even though I know it's a fiction, I watch movies sometimes about historical incidents as an inroad to learning more about them, and I felt like I was being lied to whenever this, because like it was transparently fictional, and not in the way that the idea of putting Brian on the stand is so ridiculous that you have to ask, did that really happen? But this is like, I was like, what Brian does here, he interrogates her, right? He betrays her trust and interrogates her, and that's maybe unfair to the historical figure, William Jennings Bryan. I don't know how I feel about this scene.
I'll tell you one thing about the scene, and this goes back to something else. In a trial like this, especially a jury trial, you submit a witness list before the trial begins, and then you argue about admissibility and things like that. I got the sense she was not on the witness list, and she was surprised when she was called. That doesn't happen either. So, and of course, his interrogation of her was very heavy-handed, and a judge can intercede to stop things. In fact, in the direct examination in the real trial by Clarence Darrow of William Jennings Bryan, the judge cut it off after an hour and a half. He was grilling. Yeah, it was an hour and a half.
That's long enough, I think.
It's pretty much what the judge said. And then the judge stopped it. And then the next day, he struck all of Brian's testimony, saying it was irrelevant. Well, he had time to think about it. He should never have allowed it to happen, even though Brian wanted to do it and Darrow wanted him to do it. That doesn't matter. It should never have happened in the first place. So the judge struck all the testimony anyhow, in an attempt to really kind of help Brian, but it really didn't. Brian had disenfranchised, he had alienated some of his followers because of his testimony. Seemed to indicate that, maybe it's not all literally true. So, but that was a net effect, a real effect of the entire thing. And he spent his next couple of days trying to rehabilitate himself, and then died in his sleep. Not of what they call a busted belly. Is that what they said in the movie?
I was laughing at that one.
That's actually something. That's something Clarence Darrow actually said about him after the fact. What H.L. Mencken said was that God tried to kill Darrow and hit Brian instead. Which they give that line from real life Darrow to fictional Mencken to make him seem meaner. It was like Darrow wasn't like. The real Clarence Darrow would not have packed up a Bible and a Darwood in a suitcase and walked off into the sunset. He was a smelly atheist, right?
He's an agnostic, not an atheist.
Right. That's a line that he said to become more representative. I mean, he's a Christopher Hitchens type, or Voltaire, I guess is more respectable. He is anti-clerical. He just liked making fun of religion. And some of the people on his team did not want to be associated with him for that reason, as he had people who were theistic, evolutionists or scientists or believed in God. and you have this guy come in who's kind of a pillar of unbelief. I feel like right. But anyway, the death of Brian is depicted in the film. I mean, it's already incredible that he died so soon after the trial.
Because it was only like 5 days, right?
Like literally 5 days later.
5 days.
So I spot them this dramatic. Like if they had used, if it had been an actual dramatization of the trial, I mean, they could have gotten away with that on the basis of license. But they probably shouldn't have done. I mean, Brian did not want there to be any punishment to make Scopes a martyr, and he had offered to pay his fine, the real Bryant. And it's the opposite of this Brady, who thinks that he should be punished more, and he gets so worked up about it he collapses. So
Well,
maybe that's more.
That was a fried chicken talking.
Yeah. So,
Another thing you don't do, you don't eat fried chicken in a courtroom. So,
right.
Yeah.
Brian, did you say he's always depicted overeating? I didn't notice that in the film.
Oh, yeah, it comes up several times, especially like the first night that they're in town. He's like taking interview questions, but he's like eating the whole time. And
there's
like,
a reference to it too later.
Yeah, and in the background, Spencer Tracy is like having dinner with Brian's wife. And they're like, oh, geez, he's really holding court. And isn't it gross how he's eating all the time?
a lot of times you depict overeaters by, they're the ones who stick the napkin in their, thing like it so it drapes all over the place. That's almost a key that person's an overeater in a film.
I thought the food looked pretty good. I wanted to try this food.
I want fried chicken myself, but I'm not going to eat it in court.
So I wanted to talk just a little bit about what happens in the movie at the very end, which you brought up here, which is that as the trial is winding down, almost anticlimactically, I wouldn't even say almost, definitely anticlimactically, it's a tiny fine that gets levied, and then they're immediately like, well, we're just going to appeal it anyways. So it's really not like there's no victor claimed in science versus religion in this play. But the one casualty here is this character, Matthew Harrison Brady, dies as basically the trial is wrapping up shortly after he's given his testimony. And I thought, first of all, I was like, there's no way he actually died at the end of the trial. And he didn't, but he did die less than a week after the trial ended. And that is kind of crazy when you think about it. It's like one of the things he's best known for. He wrapped it up, he gave a couple speeches, and then yes, he died. And symbolically, when he gives that testimony where you see kind of this unmoving pillar of how he views the world start to crumble a little bit, the death is sort of symbolic. It's the notion of progress. This man who kind of, again, as we've talked about, not really representing history. Like William Jennings Bryan wasn't actually this figure, but this in the play, in the movie, this figure who kind of is fundamentalism incarnate, I guess. These kind of beliefs incarnate, dying at the very end of the trial. That really is the outcome. Is that to some extent the unyielding view of this sort of vision of, I don't know what to say other than fundamentalism, eroding a little bit, I guess. It's like kind of what that death, how I read that death symbolically, at least.
It felt like a way of after the trial, both sides claimed victory, right? The prosecution claimed legal victory, right? Which, they won the trial, whereas the defense claimed the moral victory. And this is a way of, this is really told Kramer is not an objective observer. He clearly sides with Drummond over Brady, and this is a way of showing that you may have won, but now you're dead. It's better to be a living dog than a dead lion, I guess, to quote the Bible.
Brady gets kind of a Pyrrhic victory, where it's like, by the letter of the law, his side won the trial, but he's presented as kind of a buffoon. At least that's how it's like framed, that the crowd thinks of him, like that his argument falls apart when he's on this on the stand and being examined, and he says, basically he believes unthinkingly in everything that the Bible says. And the way that the music swells and the way that it's edited is like, this is you can't handle the truth moment when he's like, the curtain is stripped away and he just loses all credibility. It didn't hit me as hard as something like that. I don't know. But then, yeah, the next thing is the trial wraps and he's like, well, wait a minute, I need to read my closing argument. And he's standing up and trying to deliver the closing argument, but like the carnival has packed up and left town. And so he's like left in the dust and can't actually get his message across. And then he dies.
But the judge had declared the trial closed because, first off, you don't have a right to make closing arguments and they're not evidenced. And he wanted to use that closing argument to try and rehabilitate himself after what happened in the examination when he was an expert witness on the King James Version of the Bible. So, no, I mean, that didn't happen. And that's the only time in the movie you see WGN show up. And they stick their microphone right up there, right in front of the judge. You don't do that either. In fact, not with this judge. You saw him at the very beginning of the trial when he chastised that photographer, for interrupting the courtroom. And he said, "There's no more pictures there, son." I say, Harry Morgan really came across as a real judge. He really did. And in fact, of all the performances here, I really thought Frederick March, as the William Jennings Bryan stand-in, did a masterful job. I mean, he really did. In every aspect, even when he wasn't speaking, like when he was in the parade, welcome, and he was, waving to everybody, and he's just so full of himself. And, I mean, he really did a masterful job. I think more so than Spencer Tracy did as Drummond. So, I mean, Spencer Tracy gets all the publicity, but March really did the better acting job.
I think I agree with that. I mean, I think Spencer Tracy has the easier role because he's the stoic underdog, the one that you're rooting for, and he kind of just has to deliver these remarks that, to much of the audience, like Kramer frames it, sympathetic towards him. So in some ways, that's easier. And I definitely agree. I thought March was terrific as this villain, but he has moments of humanity, and he really feels lived in. He's not just a big caricature, even though he has moments where he kind of is outsized like that. But it really feels like a complex portrait of a character,
Yeah. One thing's interesting about William Jennings Bryan itself, and Gavin and Brian and Dan, you'd all mentioned all the things he did. 3-time presidential candidate, early on Secretary of State for President Wilson. When he died, 5 days after this trial, he was only 65 years old. I mean, this guy did an awful lot during his early years. In fact, I think he was the youngest candidate for president at 36 when he first ran, the first time he ran. Wow. So, I mean, this guy was not that old. Of course, that's, for me, 65 is not that old. I know you guys think otherwise, but that's 10 years of my past. So, yes, I'm thinking, he really wasn't that old, but he was defeated. At the end, he was a defeated man. And that's what you saw in the movie, even though he's trying to give his closing argument to rehabilitate his image. And WGN is pulling, this is a trivial thing. You might keep it in mind, it might come up in Jeopardy. But you see one of the WGN technicians come up and pull the microphone away from him. That was Jack Klugman. That's the only time he shows up in the movie. Later on, he would, in just a couple of years, he would star in a number of Twilight Zone episodes. Of course, then he was Quincy M.E., but it was Jack Klugman. Oh, and
he was in 12 Angry Men, of course.
That's right. He was in 12 Angry Men. He was great in 12 Angry Men. So, but yes, he comes up. He's the one that pulls the microphone away. But WGN was there. So there's a lot of historical things to this. But in a lot of ways, what really happened is actually more interesting than the fictional account.
I agree. I had a technical question. You're talking about the photographers that get castigated at the beginning. Are you allowed to take pictures in the courtroom?
The courtroom can allow you to do that. Yes, they can, but you can't do it on your own. In fact, they discourage a lot of that. You served on a jury, Gavin. When you were in the jury, did the judge take your cell phone?
I don't know if I had a cell phone.
Probably did.
This is a long time ago.
That's the first thing I did. When they impanel a jury, they take your cell phones.
That's a good idea.
We've had jury trials that have also been reversed, verdicts that have reversed because someone took a Bible into the jury room. So that's actually happened too. And then they rely upon that as evidence when it's not. So, but in this case, the King James Version of the Bible was actually entered into as evidence. Truth is stranger than the fiction.
Right.
Wow.
When I was reading about the account afterwards, like the book I was reading, it was by, I think it was called, the title was Summer for the Gods, which is something that it's a quote from Darrow when he's reminiscing about the trial in his own memoirs, written by Edward J. Larson. It won the Pulitzer Prize. It was written in 1998. So fairly recent, or had access to a lot of evidence that the first chroniclers of the trial didn't have. And he had written a new afterword that was in 2020, reflecting on how, like the reason he wrote it in 1998, it's like in the 90s, the question of evolution, like it didn't go away, but the tactics changed. Instead of trying to keep evolution out of the classroom, they were trying to get creationism into the class.
Right. First off, it becomes a science. Call it creationism. Put ism on it, and now it's a science. And so they want balanced treatment. Supreme Court shot that down too.
Well, at first, right, and then they rebranded as intelligent design. That thing was like in the 90s. That was a big topic, so it doesn't surprise me that he wrote the book when he did. But then in his afterword, he says, like, even after 1998, the thing is, it keeps coming up in court cases, and now the Supreme Court is less interested in knocking it down, to the point where nowadays is it Oklahoma?
Yes.
Or Idaho, or both. I'm not sure.
No, it's Oklahoma where the state superintendent in Oklahoma is trying to force all the public schools in that state to teach the Bible. And of course, it's the King James Version of the Bible. And many of the schools there, including the big ones, are telling him where he can put those Bibles. And not surprisingly, all the Bibles are, guess what? Trump Bibles. Someone had to buy those Bibles. So anyhow, that's a legal thing going on there. The Attorney General for Oklahoma has told the state superintendent, we're not going to defend you. You're on your own. That it's unconstitutional what you're proposing to do, because the Supreme Court has always said you can teach the Bible for secular reasons. Certainly literature. King James Version is flowery language. There could be other reasons too, but you can't teach it as an inerrancy. In other words, this is it. You follow this and that's it. You can't do that. It's kind of difficult to teach it as a historical document because a lot of places it's not. And you're going to have a tough part in the New Testament proving that Jesus actually was raised from the dead. Where's the body? Well, there's no body because he raised from the dead. Circular logic that comes into effect. You can't teach it as historically accurate. I mean, those are the kind of things. Oklahoma's that. You've got Louisiana. Louisiana is trying to get postings of the Ten Commandments in all the public school classrooms again. That was shot down in 1980 when Kentucky tried to do it. So here we are again, the same thing. And the reason why they're all doing it now, they think they have a sympathetic Supreme Court that will allow them to do these kinds of things. I have no way of predicting what the Supreme Court will do. So with a case like that, but it still goes on. It goes on. It goes on. It never goes away.
The point the book was making is that the play Inherit the Wind, first of all, it does talk about Inherit the Wind, but of course it's secondary. It says that Inherit the Wind has done a whole lot to, like, it's become the official version of the story, despite the fact that it's fiction, and despite the protestations of the author. It's just what happened. And also that this play that was originally written about McCarthyism has ended up being more relevant as being surface level text. It's about what it's about.
Mm-hmm.
Oh.
I actually was interested because Brian's closing statement was published in newspapers. He didn't drop dead in the courtroom. He lived a couple days, and his words did get out there in some respect. And I don't need to read this whole thing, but I just wanted to share a little bit of Brian via Brian, that because it reflects what Gavin was saying earlier about his views on World War I, William Jennings Bryan's views on World War I, And it's interesting that this was 1925 and it feels kind of prophetic. Because he says, science is a magnificent force, but not a teacher of morals. It can perfect machinery, but it adds no moral restraints to protect society from the misuse of the machine. It can build gigantic intellectual ships, but constructs no moral rudders for the control of storm-tossed human vessels. And that's the gist of it. He says that same thing a few times. Basically, science in and of itself provides no basis for morality.
Mm-hmm. It's kind of interesting, Brian. If you take a couple of those sentences and you substitute the word religion for science, what do you get? In war, religion has proven itself an evil genius. It has made war more terrible than it ever was before. Religion has made war so hellish that civilization was about to commit suicide. You can do that over and over again, and you'll come up with the other side of this argument. Religion is not exactly the do-all, say-all. And you saw the worst aspects of religion in this case in the tyranny of the mob, pushed on by the ambition of the individual.
Well said. The ending part, towards the end of the statement, he's talking about how the technological innovations have made war really terrible. I mean, think back to World War I, which, you know, is 10 years in the past in 1925. Not quite that. 5 years in the past. And then he says, and who knows what's coming next? ...
Uh,
Yikes. Yeah, I think there would be some important technology that would, in upcoming wars, that would have long-term reverberations. But yeah, I want to just take a moment and state maybe the obvious elephant in the room, which Kevin brought up, which is that I think the themes of this film, or at least the themes that this film is interrogating, I mean, as Kevin said, it doesn't go away. It just keeps coming back in different forms. Honestly, not all that different forms. There's a lot here that not exactly verbatim, but not too far off. You replace a few words here and there, and you get the gist of some of what you're hearing today. And I mean, you know, our current president essentially ran on a platform of, I'm going to bring back, well, I guess there was a lot of things that some of it was not exactly in line with this, but I'm kind of thinking the Project 2025 angle specifically had a lot of it, I think, is comes from the perspective similar to where the William Jennings Bryan, or I guess Matthew Harrison Brady, because we know that the real Bryan was a little more complicated than that, but the Matthew Harrison Brady character as kind of representing this Southern community, that kind of force guiding the policy, the campaign that this current presidency is bringing, and is once again reshaping everything about American culture, American government, the courts, the judges, the way that they approach these things, the language they use, the public appeal they use to particularly to Christians. And I think this is a film that's worth watching, not strictly because it depicts a historical moment, an important historical moment, but because these are themes that recur throughout American history and continue to recur throughout American history. And in the headlines that we're seeing today. I mean, I'm sure I could pull up thehill.com or some news website and find literally a headline that there's echoes of what's going on in this trial, if I wanted to.
You're not too far off. One of the essences of McCarthyism, just to describe that whole era, was that people weren't being persecuted, their lives and livelihoods destroyed based upon what they did, but upon what their opinions were and whom they chose to associate with. You are seeing the same thing now. The people are being persecuted, their lives and livelihoods destroyed based upon what their opinions are and whom they associate with, and not for anything that they've actually done. We are approaching a constitutional crisis. This is a First Amendment issue. So yes, and it's going to have to play out. And we only hope that there are sufficient numbers of Clarence Darrells out there. This is where you need a Darrell, but a William Jennings Bryan also would have been sympathetic or empathetic at least, on this. This would have been an issue the two of them would have agreed with, despite the fact the way he is portrayed in the film and in real life was well past his prime. Nevertheless, he was a complicated person, but he did believe in the common man. That common man is on the outs.
So Brian Terrell, not Brian, the William Jennings Bryan. Did you feel like this spoke to our current day, or did you view it more as like from its historical context?
I think it absolutely is timely, but also America has dealt with a lot of the same conflicts for centuries. In Ken Burns' The Civil War, people say the Civil War was, they should say the Civil War is. It's like we have these regional and ideological tensions kind of in the fabric of the country. So yeah, I thought it was a very good selection of a film for this time and place.
And I really wish that everyone would watch this film, because I think you'll learn something about yourself, how you react. Do you think it's fair? Which characters do you find sympathetic? Which aspects of the various arguments do you find resonant with you or find frustrating? Because, I don't know, sometimes it's hard sometimes you need to take a step back and look at something not like directly, but like something that kind of refracts the truth or the concepts that are in play in modern society. At least that's my opinion. I don't know. But I think it's a film worth watching, and we'll see kind of how that bears out when we kind of rate the film. But I guess Kevin and Gavin, I wanted to make sure you guys had a chance, if there was other aspects of this film, or Gavin, I don't know if you had any other kind of like religious concepts you wanted to talk about here that you had kind of prepared. By the way, before I hand it over to you guys, shout out to Gavin, who always reads a book before he comes on our podcast. Like I'm always impressed with the amount of reading and the amount of background knowledge you bring to these, Gavin. So just a quick thank you there.
I'm flattered. I don't know. I feel like it's important to know about a subject before you talk about it. I feel like that's a dying art in the age of YouTube and TikTok. I think I've said my piece in the film. I was looking over the notes I'd actually written, and I don't have anything else I want to add. I'm ready to give it a rating whenever you guys are.
The only thing I would add is that what started this whole controversy, the basis for the actual trial and then Inherit the Wind itself, was that politics and religion mixed. And that's not really brought out very strongly in either the trial or in the movie itself. There is an axiom that when you mix politics with religion, religion always loses. And that's one thing you can take from this film, because religion certainly isn't portrayed very well in the Inherit the Wind. It comes out, even though it's fundamentalism, it still comes out as religion, and it comes out on the short straw here. But, it's something to keep in mind, and we're going to face that problem. That is going to be a problem as well, trying to mix politics with religion and enforce orthodoxy on everyone. That's a real danger.
Well, now that you've said that, to add that I'm concurrently reading a book about the history of the Vatican Bank for a completely different project, and I'm arriving at a similar conclusion. Not just politics, but maybe money as well. Mm-hmm. I'm going to be writing about The Godfather Part 3 soon. That just has a really Byzantine plot involving the Vatican Bank scandal, which is like the real facts are crazier than the film like this. So that's all I want to add to that.
Well, I'm excited to read it. I'm excited to learn about it. Dan, you said you've not seen Godfather 3, right?
That's right. Maybe this will give me an excuse to go see Godfather 3. And listeners, if you come find us at thegoodsfilmpodcast.com, there's a link to our Discord. We'll be sure to drop the link to Gavin's article about, I don't know if it's just Godfather 3 or the whole Godfather saga, but I am definitely looking forward to reading that. Gotcha. One non sequitur before we get to our grand finale of rating, and this is a question aimed at Kevin here. So, Kevin, as someone who has an interest in legal matters, I'm wondering if, this is a two-pronged question, do you have a favorite film about a trial or a courtroom drama? And separately, do you have a favorite depiction of the justice system in action, which is not necessarily the same thing? Something could be a better movie than another thing and be a worse or less interesting representation of the justice system, and vice versa.
Boy, that's a tough one, because it's hard to watch a film, a courtroom drama, without picking it apart. Because, they're trying to, I can tell you my least favorite, but that was an actual trial. Watching the O.J. Simpson trial was very painful to watch, because the judge was not a particularly good judge. But, never, when I tried to think about good ones, it's hard to do that because, I end up picking them apart. But, I have seen some films where I thought, the trial work was actually pretty good. It made sense what they did. One of them, I wouldn't call it great, but it was actually good, and that was Red Rooms. The Canadian courtroom, the Quebec courtroom. Was it Quebec or was it Montreal? Never mind, Canadian.
Montreal's in Quebec.
Okay, yes, I know, but I was thinking of Quebec City. But
No, it was in Montreal.
Okay, in the 51st state.
Politics out of it. Let's keep politics
I'm
out
sorry.
of it.
Well, okay.
Oh, I didn't say we need to keep politics out of it, just that historically we keep politics out of it. But yes.
So, but I mean, that's just a more recent one. I know I've seen some, but to be honest with you, Dan, right off the knock here, I can't think of one that I would say, yeah, this is a really good one. I've seen some that were actually pretty good, but a lot of times it wasn't the courtroom drama, but what led up to it and what occurred that eventually came down with a verdict that was fair. There's been a couple like that, but nothing major.
Can I try to jog your memory?
Sure.
Okay, Midnight in the Garden of Good and Evil.
All right, that was a good one. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. And that was actually a pretty good one. And that one I liked a lot because it took place where I used to live. It was, down in Savannah in southern Georgia, southeastern Georgia, and I used to live in Augusta, just north of there. And in fact, the final trial took place in Augusta Courthouse. So, I was interested in that one. That was actually a pretty good film, but a lot of it had to do with how they sorted things out to find who the killer was and whether that person had the requisite intent to kill. So, that was a fun movie. It was a fun movie.
One more. Miracle on 34th Street.
I was going to say Miracle on 34th Street. What are your opinions?
Well, even as a kid, you scratch your head. I mean, that's not a good example. First, the original one is hilarious, but you don't realize how corrupt the system is until you're older. When you're watching, and the judge is up there and he can't make a decision. He's looking at his political boss. His political boss is Fred Mertz, from
I Love Lucy.
I Love Lucy. So Fred's down there and he's, giving him stern looks and then talking to him in chambers about what decision you should come up with. So, I mean, the whole system is corrupt. So I know I wouldn't call that a good courtroom drama. It's a lot of fun because eventually they establish that this guy is Saint Nick. So, I mean, yay. That's not the kind of courtroom drama I had in mind.
Okay.
The one that I was going to shout out that I've heard is a better example of actual courtroom operating than you might suspect, given that it is overtly a silly comedy, is the film My Cousin Vinny, starring Joe Pesci.
I have never seen that film.
What? We got to have you back to do My Cousin Vinny.
I have never seen it. I see bits and pieces about it. Now, I will tell you, there is one movie that I thought was very good drama that takes place in a courtroom, and it's Kramer versus Kramer. That is actually a very good courtroom drama and very accurate. So if you're into that sort of thing, now I know I've Yeah, I saw Gavin's surprise, but I was surprised you'd never seen Dumbo. So I was anyhow. Yes, I mean I haven't seen.
I've seen Dumbo now.
Yeah,
So
but you haven't seen The
get off,
Rescuers.
get off my back. Okay.
Well, it's funny because I won't belabor this too much, but there's actually a couple of moments in My Cousin Vinny that there are sort of echoes here in Inherit the Wind. So one is the dramatic call of an unconventional witness, and that is the Marissa Tomei character in My Cousin Vinny, not William Jennings Bryan as it is here. But that's kind of like one of the cruxes of the film in that as well. And another is our discussion about the judge as sort of sympathetic. The Fred Gwynn, who is one of the Munsters, most famously, a very tall fellow, imposing stature. And here he's doing a ridiculous Southern accent in My Cousin Vinny. And of course, it takes place in the South with these Northerners coming in, trying to make their point in their case. Very different circumstances and themes, but some echoes of it. So I like Brian's idea that we could have you back on sometime to talk about My Cousin Vinny. I think that might be fun. So I guess I will talk us into rating the film. Is It Good is our signature section where we each give the movie a rating on our 8-point goodness scale, ranging from very not good, which is a 1 out of 8, to our masterpiece rating, which we call a tour to good, and that's an 8 out of 8. And Kevin, if you can also think of it as a 4-star scale, with each number being a half star if you're unfamiliar with our Is It Good scale. But I will hand it over to Brian first. So Brian, did you find Inherit the Wind? Is Inherit the Wind good?
So we didn't dive too much into the production design and the actual like bits and pieces of putting this movie together, but I thought they were really effectively done, especially how hot it seemed in this courtroom and how that was used to build the tension. I liked how the musical score was used. You know, the song list was not robust, as we said. We get a lot of that one song, but I liked the instrumental stings. And Spencer Tracy's great. March is like exceptional. And whether or not it would be realistic to a courtroom setting, all the orations they get to give were pretty powerful. So I really, really liked it. I'm going to give it a 7, and exceptionally good. I watched one of the multiple remakes this has gotten, and that was the 1999 version with George C. Scott and Jack Lemmon. And I love both of those actors, but that just didn't do anything for me. It was like a cheapo TV movie. Didn't have any of the like high angle, low angle camera stuff that's going on in the 1961. Didn't have this dramatic like chiaroscuro black and white cinematography. I thought this was a good movie.
So that's a 7 out of 8 from Brian. Gavin, why don't you go ahead? Is Inherit the Wind good?
Right. I enjoyed this film quite a bit. And on the surface, it's absolutely the kind of film that I would hate, as I hate films that are extremely didactic or try to confirm opinions that the audience members likely have. And it's the grandstanding, it's the orations where I thought enjoyed to listen to, and also just the whole theatricality of it, like the carnivalesque atmosphere of the trial, especially when it was drawing on some of the weird stuff that actually happened. So it's the insistence on calling both the lawyers colonel, or is doing anything to make sure they're on equal footing. That made me howl with laughter, and just a very strong production in general. The one thing I don't like is, I know it's supposed to be a work of fiction, but it's like saying that Last Temptation of Christ is not based on the Gospels; it's based on a novel, but the novel is based on the Gospels. So, this wasn't the playwright's intent, but they more or less overwrote what really happened. And I think in some ways this movie is unfair to William Jennings Bryan, and it's really unfair to the people of Dayton, Tennessee. That makes them look backwards as possible. And if you say there's some truth to that, they were nice during the trial. They were burning people in effigy. And they invent a terrible preacher character just to make them look even more bigoted. So that kind of rubbed me the wrong way a little bit. I would settle on a very strong 6. In my estimation.
Mm-hmm.
one thing I just want to throw out there, just interject very briefly, and then I'll hand the floor to Kevin. But we've said Lawrence and Lee a few times. I think we might have introduced them as they're the playwrights of the Inherit the Wind play. One thing Brian pointed out, as we were prepping for this episode, is that the name of the Lee, so it's Jerome Lawrence, and the Lee of Lawrence and Lee is named Robert E. Lee, just like the general. I assume not the same person.
How do you know? How do you know?
I did actually look it up to confirm. It's not the same guy. The original one is Edmund, one is Edwin.
Those details. Because I figure, I just saw Sinners today, and it has Michael B. Jordan. Of course, the B's there, so you don't confuse the actor with the much older basketball players. I figure he has a middle initial, and it's the same middle initial, so obviously it must be the same person. Just lived for a very long time and had a complete change of heart about everything.
But Kevin, if you're so inclined, do you have a rating on our Is It Good scale that you would like to give Inherit the Wind?
I do. May I preface that with some remarks? One is, the Colonel thing never happened. That's fictitious. However, William Jennings Bryan really was a colonel. He was in the United States Army during the Spanish-American War, and he actually was a colonel. So, it wasn't an honorific. That's just, again, if it comes up on Jeopardy, at least you know. So, and there were some other things that I thought, what actually happened was more compelling than how they presented it. One of them, the banner, read your Bible. There actually was a big banner that said, read your Bible daily. But that banner wasn't on the outside of the courthouse. It was in the courtroom. Wow. On the wall. So read your Bible daily. And that's the first thing Darwin, complained about. He goes, I want a banner the same size and, the same exposure that says, read your Darwin. And that's when the judge decided, well, we'll just take the banner down. So, that actually did happen, but it was actually more dramatic in life, real life. So there were a lot of things about the movie I do like at the beginning. I really liked the start of this. It was very dramatic. And like I said, Leslie Uggams is singing a cappella, a song that I don't particularly like. But it doesn't matter. It's, it shows up again and again, different versions of it. So, even though, I know Brian, made a good statement about the soundtrack itself, I found it irritating. Don't these people know more than two songs? So, and there were a lot of things like that. So for the most part, yes, I really like the movie. The problem is, though, is that I know a lot about the trial itself, and it gets a little off-putting in places. Frederick March's portrayal is great. Spencer Tracy's portrayal, great. After I got by the idea of Dick York, not being on Bewitched and actually playing, that, and the first time I saw him, I go, he's too weak to play that character. But anyhow, when it comes down to the final analysis, yes, I like the movie, but like Gavin, I gave it a strong 6. I wasn't willing to go to exceptionally good or toward a good. I thought it was really good, and it's an important part of Americana. Both the trial and the play and the movie. They're important parts, but I thought it was pretty much a strong 6.
As I lead into my thoughts on whether this is good, I'll give a brief defense of the soundtrack, which is I found it thematically interesting that they did the same song over and over again, because it kind of represented the stubbornness of the culture. Whether that was intentional or it was just Kramer was short-sighted on his soundtrack selection, who knows? But that was something that kind of occurred to me. But I'm pretty much there with all of you. I think we're all in approximately the same tier in terms of how we're looking at this. I'm also going to give this a high-end 6 out of 8, which we call very good here. And pretty much echoing what a lot of people have already said. I said this kind of up front too. I just find it refreshing sometimes to watch well-made older movies where the entire frame is designed and well used, and the concept of blocking, like which people you're going to see from which angles and which props, that sometimes gets hand waved away in modern films. It's just a well constructed piece of cinema. Visually, it flows well too. It's a little over 2 hours, but I thought it went pretty quickly. My disappointments came in. It really falls apart if you're interested in the procedure of the case at all, of the trial at all. I mean, you do get the real life, truth is stranger than fiction. They did bring up the prosecuting lawyer as a witness, as a Bible expert in the middle of the trial. But I kind of wanted to give me a little bit more to think about in terms of like, how does all this stuff actually interplay with the law more, which now that we've kind of talked through it, I kind of understand maybe this is actually representing the reality that this really was never about the law ever. So like, this was just a big kind of display of rhetoric of two different belief systems and ways of viewing the world. But excellent production, excellent acting. It is didactic, but in a way that I think still echoes as relevant. And I think everyone will watch this and have something that speaks to them, that evokes something in them, in their belief system and how they view the world today and politics today and what's going on in the headlines. And so, or maybe if you don't, maybe that tells you something about how you view the current landscape of politics. But anyways, I think it's a very good film, and I think it's aged well, and I think it's very much worth watching. So strong, very good for me as well. And that brings us to the end of our discussion about Inherit the Wind. And this has been very interesting, and I'm really always grateful to have Gavin on the pod. And Kevin, thank you very much for joining us. And Brian Terrell, not Williams Jennings Bryan. What are we going to be watching and discussing, just you and me, next week?
Well, we're going to keep the Easter/Passover spirit going for a little bit longer, because I want to talk about the 10 Commandments from 1956, Charlton Heston and Yul Brynner, directed by Cecil B. DeMille. And it's a religious epic from a time when they were in peak form. So I also just want to say, though, thank you, Gavin and Kevin, for joining us. I think this was a great discussion.
Always a pleasure.
Yeah. Thank you, guys.
Alrighty. Happy Easter to you too. By the time people are listening to this, it might be past Easter, but happy Easter to all our listeners as well. And have a good one. And go watch Inherit the Wind if you haven't seen it.